Sixth nuclear state is Israel. Israel started because of the Suez crisis. Most of you may recall that in 1956 that the Brits and the French and the Israelis got together to invade Egypt and retake the Suez Canal that Nasser had nationalized. They hadn't told the Americans about this beforehand, and when it started, Eisenhower was very annoyed and told them all to get out of there with the appropriate threats, economic threats. The British were already nuclear powers, but with that turning of the American allies, the French and the Israelis said, we have to have nuclear weapons. The Suez crisis was in October of '56. When Eisenhower leaned on them, they all withdrew. But the crisis in November '56, Golda Meir and Shimon Peres go to Paris. And they meet with their counterparts in the French government. And in November of 1956, the French and the Israelis put together a joint nuclear weapons program wherein basically the Israelis are going to do the technology and the French are going to do the heavy lifting, building the reactors. That's the way it played itself out. In February of 1960, the French fired a device in the Algerian desert, but WAGs have noted that with that shot in February of '60, the first time that two nations went nuclear with one shot. India was the seventh power to go nuclear. Interesting story. The triggers in India were their border war in '62 with China and then China's 1964 nuclear test. They started looking at all this, but Indira Gandhi was the forcing power that said, we're going to do it. When Indira Gandhi came to power in '67, she turned on a major nuclear weapons program. They had help from the Russians, and they tested in May of '74. A couple of interesting things about this test. First of all, I was at the Pentagon at the time running a bunch of reconnaissance program. We never saw it coming. All of a sudden, bang, the Indians tested. That's because, among other things, they dug the hole by hand. Maybe that's the way they did things, but they dug the hole by hand. The other aspect that us bureaucrats really admire is Indira Gandhi, only 2 weeks before the test, did she tell her Minister of Defense, her foreign minister, and all those people that, oh, by the way, I have a nuclear program that we're going to fire in 2 weeks. She'd done it all with black money and a weapons lab in the dark. That's really pretty good work. Pakistan is the eighth nuclear country. That's the problem. Pakistan, the triggers for Pakistan were the civil wars where Bangladesh split off. But the program, basically the 1974 Indian test, but basically the Pak sort of did a bunch of studies, but nothing much happened until '82. It was very important to understand 81, 82, Deng Xiaoping consolidates power in China, and he clearly makes a decision to transfer nuclear weapon technology to the Marxist and Muslim third world. Not just Pakistan, Algeria, all these other things we see. It is clear that Deng Xiaoping started the transfer of nuclear technology. In '82, Beijing and the other cities were overrun with Pakistani scientists. They got the full dump. They were even given drawings of what's known as the Check 4 device. And in fact, the first Pakistani nuclear device was not tested in Pakistan. The first test of a Pakistani nuclear device was tested out at the Chinese test site in Lop Nur in May of 1990. They tested, the Paks tested again in '98, but Pakistan is really the problem because, first of all, it's a country that developed weapons for religious reasons. Every other country developed for national security reasons. General Zia, who was in charge, made it very clear we are developing a Muslim bomb, and when we develop it, we're going to share it with the Muslim world. Now as happens, they don't have orderly government transitions in Pakistan. His plane mysteriously blew up. But the point is that a succession of governments have in mind this is a Muslim weapon. You end up now where Pakistan has no government. It has a president named Mr. Zardari. Mr. Zardari's claim to fame is one, he was Benazir Bhutto's widower, which is how he got elected. And number two, he's a mega crook. He spent 6 years in prison in Pakistan for corruption. And nonetheless, he got power as president. Everything's for sale, and that includes nuclear weapons. The Al-Qaeda tried before 9/11 to make a deal with guys in the Pakistani nuke program. They did not succeed. But Pakistani disintegration is really a problem. My friends tell me that a quarter of the officer corps in the Pakistani army are sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. North Korea is the last country, ninth power. North Korea probably had a lot of early help from the Chinese and the Soviets. Serious start probably with the death of, with the coming to power of Kim Jong-il. That they tested in a couple years ago. But the interesting thing about the North Korean devices is the yield and what they said to their Chinese partners. Because before they tested, the North Koreans called up their patrons in China and said, you know, FYI, we're going to test on Thursday, and here's what's going to go on. Don't be surprised. We know this from talking to our Chinese sources. But the interesting thing is, we're going to fire on Thursday, and it's going to be a 4-kiloton device. You don't, new entrants don't fire 4-kiloton devices. Every new entrant has built a Fat Man, which is imploding plutonium, and you get 20 kilotons. That's the way you do it. That's what we did. That's what the Brits did, the Chinese, the Russians, French. The North Koreans were aiming at a 4-kiloton yield. They didn't get it. The first shot, they got about 5% of the design yield. But their second shot was in May of last year. They got 2 kilotons. Why? What are they doing? I think that they are focusing on small diameter, oddly shaped, lightweight warheads for missiles as a part of a package to sell to other people. I don't think North Korea is going to become a nuclear power and threaten to nuke Honolulu, but they are selling technology big time to all buyers. And where they're going is sort of a scary thought. So what are the lessons learned from all this? Well, first of all, obviously, to me and a lot of people, and I think we need to really be reminded that the threat of a nuclear terrorist event is a very distinct possibility now, this president's term in office. And that would be a disaster if it happens. Secondly, technology does not respect national boundaries. Thirdly, nuclear power does not necessarily lead to nuclear weapons. There's a great history of nations that have developed nuclear power, had the option to make plutonium, decided not to, backed off from weapons. That nuclear power and weapons are not necessarily connected. Fourthly, it's interesting that the military are seldom, if ever, involved in the decision for a country to go nuclear. Nuclear weapons cost too much. They are political weapons. They are not weapons of war. It takes industrial nations maybe 5 or 6 years to go nuclear from the decision time they make the decision. Proliferation can be stopped. And I think that's what we really need to take heart from, that nuclear proliferation can be stopped. Kennedy feared 15 or 20 states. There's only 9. Proliferation can be stopped by internal political debate, wherein a country decides not to spend the money, by external persuasion, basically the threats and cajolery that got Ukraine to turn in their weapons, by military force. The Israelis have made it clear when push comes to shove, go blow up the reactor. But it's not unreasonable to envision as a dream that, you know, maybe India and Pakistan could be the Brazil and Argentina of 10 years from now. Half the people in India have no electricity. Why are they building nuclear weapons? It does not make any sense. North Korea, well, it's got a cuckoo in charge, so did Libya. Maybe the next generation in North Korea will change. There is hope for all this. The bad news is nobody really, I think, is thinking through the consequences of a nuclear terrorist event. The forensic guys that you all are involved with, Livermore, Los Alamos, you know, you can look at the fallout. Okay, this plutonium came from this reactor in Karachi. This enriched uranium came from this centrifuge in Russia. So what? What are you going to do? You're going to blow up Karachi? No. We really need to think through what are we going to do, not only the cleanup, but the political cleanup, and what is the declaratory policy ahead of time that goes with it. So to get back where we started, Kennedy foresaw 15 or 20 nuclear states. There's only 9. Well over a dozen nations are on hold, that non-proliferation and the stopping of nuclear weapons can be done, and that gives us all something to do. Thank you for having me. The trick was no booze and no food until you listen. So now I'll sit down, or if you have questions, or yes, sir.
I don't think there's a nuclear entity that's given up their fissile materials. What do you think the prospects of that
of a nuclear, what are the prospects of a nuclear entity, state, presumably, giving up their fissile material? I think that's very important to work at. I think a fissile materials cutoff is terribly important. As you know, everybody in this room knows that plutonium is not the same thing as 2% U-235. And getting, clearly the way you deal with proliferation is not the end zone. It's, who is doing stuff along the stages. And trying to get into other states to get to understand where is the fissile material. I was involved with getting the Russians to tell us where their plutonium was and so forth. I think it's terribly important. How you do that is left as an exercise for the student. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I've had a beer on an empty stomach, so I hope we can get this out. Comment on the idea that the best deterrent for nuclear aggression is to have nuclear weapons.
Is the best deterrent for nukes to have nukes? Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's worked. That, as I said in closing, that doesn't mean if a bomb with plutonium in it that was very inefficient, the plutonium came for Karachi and it goes off in New York, are we going to blow away Karachi? No, we're not. But you need to think ahead of time, what are you going to do? Maybe we threaten to blow up Medina. But clearly, just to say, nukes are bad and let's throw them all in the sea. I mean, the list I didn't even cover is the states that could go nuclear: Germany, Japan, South Korea. They all rely on the nuclear umbrella of the U.S. And it's very clear from, South Korea and Japan living next door to China, if the U.S. announced that all our nukes are going in the sea, those two states are going to go nuclear as just as sure as the sun goes up in the morning.
Would your answer be the same? Iran is enriching uranium. So is your answer the same when the coups run the country?
I'm sorry, a little louder about Iran.
When I said Iran is enriching uranium, so they're probably going to develop a nuclear weapon. So would your answer be the same when the coups run the country?
Iran is focused on developing nuclear weapons. My view is the Israeli solution is not the right solution. Don't go blow up Natanz, because it's buried too deep and it's going to get everybody annoyed. And here's the most important guys at the party. So I'll answer this one and we'll all sit down. But basically, my view of the Iranians, we look at the Iranians like we did the Soviets during the Cold War. Talk to them, but you've got to understand, I think, the Iranian government is like the Soviet government. They're a bunch of very corrupt nomenclatura using their religion to keep themselves in power. In the case of the Soviet Presidium, and they mouthed communist slogans, but it was how they kept their perks and power. Same thing, these guys in Iran with turbans, those are not great religious leaders. They use that as their slogans. These are very corrupt, rich people. They have been skimming oil revenues for 10 years. Mr. Rafsanjani, the former president, is a billionaire. They do not want their rice bowls overturned. And therefore, Iran is not just going to capriciously nuke Tel Aviv because they understand that the retaliation that would surely come down on their heads. That they want, I think the Iranians want nuclear weapons for deterrence, as we did during the Cold War. Once they're a nuclear state, then they can start using conventional forces to work their will in Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and so forth and so on. It is the threat of nuclear retaliation that would keep the Iranians from doing anything rash. But in fact, the way you deal with the Iranian problems is keep talking to the people, just like we did with Russia. Talk to the youngsters until the younger generation finally takes over, because Iran is just as inefficiently managed as the Soviet Union was. With that news, why, the happy folks are here with dinner, and thank you for having me.